Hi there. I saw a program yesterday which was by our Free Protestants radio organization, a very old one that basically grew out of the original radio organization. Many of our TV channels are former radio broadcasters, and then television came along. They started before I was born, the Free Protestants, and the name doesn't really describe what their mentality is, because they're really free thinking, not Protestant at all. And they also always broadcast shows that are a little bit beyond what people are usually thinking of. Much better quality, much better topics. So they used to, in the 80s for instance, they had a show called Gouden Bergen, Gold Mountains, where you had two financial investigative journalists explaining what type of constructions there were. Of course, that's also very useful for Dutch business public, but that was not the reason. And they also had a series called Beautiful Accident, which was simply a whole summer, and they have a let's say a follow-up which is called Summer Guests. But every Sunday you have somebody that is being interviewed for about 3 hours on that, and able to show movie fragments and all that stuff, and it's really interesting. And now they had a show about what Goldman Sachs did in Greece, and as one of the people in the documentary they had Nomi Prins, which we know if we watch Max Keiser's videos on RT or is On the Edge, and some other people who I cannot really name directly, an economist teacher from Greece, a guy from Bloomberg, some normal off-the-street people in Greece itself, and well, the interesting part was, basically what they were explaining in the documentary was that Greece had help from Goldman Sachs in hiding the extent of its debt, because the debt was in euros. It was transferred into different currencies at a very favorable rate, which was basically a fraudulent transaction, but it was matched by Goldman Sachs with swaps, so that eventually Greece would be, ended up captured in a kind of a lock, where they would always pay a lot of money to get out of it, and they were paying a lot of money to stay into it, and they had to reorganize their debts all the time. And the key concept here is that Sachs committed fraud by pretending that interest rates were higher or lower than they actually were. Or exchange rates with other currencies were actually different. And that's very good to finally see a program that openly explains to the Dutch public that's watching it that Goldman Sachs committed fraud, that it is a very powerful bank, that it has no conscience or mercy or ethical thinking, which Nomi Prins very well explained, and that they were involved in these processes, that they basically involved in many processes, also selling let's say very weak, faulty mortgage-backed securities, and hedging themselves against the risk at the same time. And a very nice fragment in the documentary was an interview of a Goldman Sachs employee for some kind of committee in the Senate, and the question was, there was in the email that was sent, there was a remark made about these derivatives, and it was really negative. And the guy says, yes, I regretted it was written. He worded it such that it was quite clear to him that the only thing that mattered to him was to hide the fact that this was trash and to keep the charade going, because that's what they earn money off. Typical. The guy from Bloomberg made remarks about the ECB, which are the classical misdirection and misconfusion that is taking place, that everybody basically propagates, that is American or pro-Wall Street or dumb, either of one of the three. But and that is that he says, well, if Greece defaults with the ECB, that's a big hit to the ECB and the IMF, of course. And then, of course, Germany, other countries have to bail these banks out. They have to make whole the debt that Greece can pay. No. That's the whole key to defaulting. If you default, you don't pay your debt. You go bankrupt. There's nothing to get. That's the end of the story. It's in business, let's say, normal business, let's say, going bankrupt is a very normal thing to do. If you want to get rid of your debts as a company, you go bankrupt. And then your assets kind of spread out, they break up, and then somebody might buy all the assets and make a new company out of it. And a friend of mine does that type of work, and I made him aware, and he's himself aware that that the reorganization of the company should not be under the control or under the instigation of former owners, because then you get a very nice process of getting rid of debt. It's actually quite a good model for depression, because in depression we also, anyway, that's a sidestep, but mental depression disintegrates our let's say blissful ignorance and perception of the world into a very detailed perception, which is always very depressing. But then afterwards it reconstitutes itself in a new rearrangement of our reality, because we have basically touched reality and then we come back. Touching reality is very depressive. It's depressing, and you get depressed to do it, and then you can go on your blissful merry way again. Anyway, that's a sidestep to the psychological process, but it's very akin to a common default in a company. So the Bloomberg guy was giving the wrong information, but the good thing is just that Dutch people see that bankers can be crooks and criminals, that they can give me the benefit of the doubt. The fact that I have not been talking nonsense for years, even though I mainly heard my nonsense from people like Max Keiser and Peter Schiff and Mark Faber, which is not really talking about banking fraud, but anybody else that I could find, because I of course looked into it. There was a Greek economics professor that also had a thing to say. I'm making sure that my food doesn't get cold. And it's all vegetables. It's vegetarian, but I put a link to his video below this. He's a very impressive person to watch and to hear talk, and he was very good in the documentary to explain that these bankers are parasites, that they are sucking money out of and his theory is that out of the world, and his theory is that he has an analogy of a global Minotaur, which is a monster that used to live in the basement of a king Midas, I believe, and he says that, well, New York is this kingdom of Midas, which basically controls the whole world through its wealth, and it's a very strict regime. But in the basement it has a monster, and the monster has to be fed with, in Greece mythology, with young people, and in the case of America, with funds from around the world. They have to flow back to New York. And he explained, or his theory is that that's basically a result of post-Bretton Woods economy, which was basically, it's a long story, but he says, well, it's a slow process of economic disintegration of the world that we're in, and money needs to flow around, but the US wasn't productive anymore. So to give you an impression and not to bore you, he says, well, after the Second World War, the US was very productive, so it had to export its goods, and to be able to export it, it had to fund foreign countries. So they have to give money, Marshall Plan, etc. But later on, it wasn't as productive anymore, and it was actually the other way around, and for that, money had to flow in a different way. All that's fine, and I really advise you to listen to his the way he explains it. It's interesting, but it's myopic. And I always come back to this: if you only talk about money, and if you think that money flowing back to the US is important, it's not important at all. It's what you can buy with the money that's important. It's a means of exchange, money. It's not the thing itself. And so what he's basically saying exactly what I'm saying, but he's just not. He's putting it on the one foot, which is the credit, the money, and you have to stand on the other foot as well, the carbon. And then you see the whole picture, which is that the US at a certain point got control over the carbon in the world, and as a result also became the emitter of the credit in the world. So the petrodollar was created, everybody knows the petrodollar. But it's extremely fundamental that it's a petrodollar. Without it, it wouldn't have any use, and without it you cannot stimulate productivity outside the country with the petrodollar. You know, it doesn't mean, let's say, if I send let's say Indonesia rupiah or something like that, or just currency from a non-oil country to any part of the world, then of course that part of the world cannot produce very much, because they cannot buy the energy to do that with the currency that they get from me. It's useless. If I give them monopoly money, it doesn't work, because the monopoly is not, oil traders don't accept it. They accept the dollar, and that's why it was so important to have the dollar. And the sucking up the money from around the world back to New York has a very strict, very recognizable function, which is you have to save energy wherever you can, because your power is derived from your ability to supply energy. So if dollars end up in bank accounts, you have to get them before somebody puts them back into circulation and spends them and wants to buy gasoline with them. And that's why I'm be talking about the fact that the financial crisis is a carbon credit crisis, and the way to resolve it is to reduce the credit in circulation so that there is less credit to buy carbon with, less money in circulation to buy carbon with. And what's a better way to prepare for a carbon credit crisis? By putting many regions in the world in debt. Of course, that debt is spent in society and ends up usually with the energy companies. That's fine. That's where it should be. The money should end up with energy companies. Then it will not be spent on energy, of course, because an energy company will not give its money back to circulation for people to spend on the same energy, unless there's enough energy, but there's not, so they're not going to do that. So you loan out money to people, they spend it on energy, and then they have to start paying your debt, your interest rate. And that sucks money out of circulation, and wherever you can do that, whether it's Greece, Portugal, Spain, you'll be saving, you will basically be protecting the value of your carbon credit. Anyway, this video is way too long, my food's getting cold, so I'm gonna eat now, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll put some links, maybe not directly, but later below this video, so you can see the programs I'm talking about.